Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. So, NATO is getting together. The G7 is getting together. NATO's getting together. The NATO leadership, and I'm hearing that one of the things that it's going to be talked about is that the 2% of GDP target might actually be at the low end. That there might be pressure to increase spending and beyond that. So I thought it would be good to reach out to David Perry. David is the president and CEO of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. He's a host of the Defense Deconstructed podcast, and he's written recently a really interesting article about how defense spending has gone up. And it's gone from, I think you said, 5 billion to 11 billion over the course of the last couple of years. So it is going up. But now I'm hearing that 2% might not be enough. So are we going to have to go to 2%, or maybe we have to go to more? And so, David Perry, welcome to the show. What's going to happen with defense spending?
Well, thanks for having me on. I think kind of two things that are clear at this point, I guess maybe three. Our defense spending is going up. I think the other thing that's clear, though, it's going to have to go up a lot more. And I think the other thing that's clear is that Canada's going to get a lot of pressure, because what comes with those opportunities that are coming up just in the month of June alone, the Prime Minister is going to be in front of significant world leaders two different times between hosting the G7 and then going to that NATO summit. And I think he's going to get pressure from some of our allies at both of those meetings, and certainly the latter one.
The NATO Secretary General suggested that 5% is going to be something on the table at this summit, NATO summit in June. Really? 5%? That's going to be like 3 times what we're spending now.
Yeah. So I think a bit of a nuance on the 5% that, so what I think the discussion and what the Secretary General has elaborated on other circumstances, and this also seems to be the official U.S. position, so it's, I think there's a fair amount of credence to it, is that by a relatively consistent way of measuring the spending, the target would increase from the floor of 2% to a target of 3.5%, like by give or take roughly the same methodology of basically actual expenditures on military capacity or armed forces or kind of associated organizations that are contributed to it, like the small amount of spending that we currently undertake on the Canadian Coast Guard for things like allowing the Canadian Navy to get in and out of our ports, doing some ice breaking to facilitate that kind of movement. But basically, the 3.5% would be by roughly the same methodology that exists today. And then there's discussion about adding another 1.5% of kind of more loosely associated spending. So some discussion about like production of critical minerals, if it was going to go into a defense supply chain, as an example, potentially some discussion about investments in defense industrial base, which would be contributing like linearly directly to the military capability of the alliance, but would be generally sort of supporting it in a looser definition. And adding those two components together, 3.5% by kind of the traditional way that we've approached this, and another 1.5% of GDP, that would get you to the 5 that the U.S. is pushing for. But you're right. I mean, stitched all together, it's a giant increase. But even 3.5% or 3% is a giant increase over where we are today, because we still aren't living up to the old targets.
You said we're spending 11 billion today. That's not 2%, is it?
No, that 11 billion is on the capital. So, and to be pedantic and technical, it's the allocation that was provided in the new estimates that were just published by the government just a week ago, and that's only the portion of the budget that looks at investments in equipment or infrastructure. And the point I was making with that is that 5 years ago it was less than half the amount that it is today. The total amount that we are proposing to spend for the last figures that were officially available from NATO was about $40 billion. So that 10 is kind of give or take a quarter.
Okay, so 40 billion, my understanding is that's less than 2%. Is that correct?
That's true. That's estimated to be about 1.44%.
1.4. So that's going to have to more than double to get to that 3.5. That'll only get you to 2.9, 2.8. So we're going to add a $40 billion number to our expenditure, 40 billions?
I think, again, it depends on the year, what assumptions you make about growth in the economy, all those kinds of variables. I think by the end of the day, to hit that number, it would be closer to 60 or 70 billion, depending on the time
additional incremental spending.
Over and above what we've already committed to. Yeah.
So I want to read for you a quote from an article that you shared about what this NATO Secretary General said. He said, I quote, Russia has teamed up with China, North Korea, and Iran. Secretary General Mark Rutte told a NATO Parliamentary Assembly Forum. They're expanding their militaries and their capabilities. They are preparing for long-term confrontation, he said. To meet this challenge and others, Mr. Rutte said, we are finalizing a plan to dramatically increase defense spending across the alliance. Do you agree that China, North Korea, and Iran are preparing for long-term confrontation?
Yeah, I think it's hard to look at what they've done and not come to that conclusion. You take a bunch of different examples from what's happening between Russia and Ukraine, with China supporting Russia through a number of different means, economically as well as militarily, and both the North Koreans and the Iranians providing direct support to the Russian war effort there. And they've acted in concert in a number of different ways to try and push the envelope, rewrite some of the international rules of conduct. And there's quite clearly sharing of military technology happening between the four of them.
So do we have a choice? Do we have to spend this? Or are we derelict if we don't?
So I think kind of a couple different ways to look at it. One would be where the alliance goes generally and what the specific target is. And I think that there's potentially some room to negotiate the exact new spending target. Although I think the Secretary General, I think, is in part trying to do a lot of the work that maybe didn't happen under the previous Trump administration to make to clear to the Trump administration this go around that NATO and allies in Europe and Canada are actually listening to American concerns. Because you remember, it wasn't very long ago, there was a lot of speculation right after the U.S. election by people who had, for instance, been the national security advisor under Mr. Trump the first time, who thought that the U.S. president was going to try and take the United States out of the NATO alliance. Out of the alliance completely, which would have massively negative consequences for everybody else's security. So I think in part what is happening here is likely an effort to try and assure the president that there are people listening to his concerns and trying to do something about it. So that's kind of a bigger picture sense. But in terms of your question about Canada, I think very clearly we are heading into this summit in amongst the worst positions of all allies, because we are not just meeting that target, but we don't have a funded plan to get to the old target. To be clear, the old 2% target that dates back to 2014 was recently reaffirmed. We have not yet made a funding commitment to put enough cash into the Department of National Defense's budget planning framework to allow it yet to get to 2%. And we are about the only ally in the alliance that's in that situation.
Why? You know, you think about, we've got a war in Ukraine, we've got a war in Gaza, we've got the Secretary of Defense in the United States suggesting there's potential for issues with Taiwan, and that's the next big thing. You know, in the debate, the English language debate, when our current prime minister, was asked what's the biggest threat to Canada, he said China. Like, that's what he said. I was shocked it wasn't a follow-up question to that statement that he made. With that kind of a scenario, that's unusual and unique from the last, since the Cold War started, other than, I guess, other than Afghanistan, Iran, Iraq, etc. But we're almost at a world war. We've got two wars going on. We got potentiality for a third. Do we have a choice? Like, don't we have to do this?
I think we have to do this if we want to keep anything resembling good standing in one of the cornerstones of our security and foreign policy, the NATO alliance. I think we have tried to skate by this for way too long, and we've run out of runway to do that. To give Mr. Carney a little bit of a break, King Charles, His Majesty, has not even been home yet for a full week, and was only here opening Parliament less than a week ago. So he is quite new, in that position that he's taken is quite new, and you didn't hear language like that from his predecessor.
Sure didn't. You're CEO of something called the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. What is that?
We're a Canadian international policy think tank. We focus on a range of different international policy issues, foreign policy, international trade, a little bit on development, some national security work, energy exports, energy security as a component of trade in particular, and then defense is a big line of effort for us. We have offices in Ottawa and Calgary, and we work on a range of these different files, engaging with parliamentarians, stakeholders in the media, people like yourselves, interested Canadians, producing podcasts, papers, and hosting roundtables and conferences.
You got your doctor of philosophy, your PhD in political science, and your dissertation was the link between Canadian defense resource management and the defense budget and defense procurement. Is that what you're talking about? It's resources and the link between resources and defense?
Yeah, to a large extent, essentially, how much money national defense is given and what are the rules on how it can be spent, was what I did my doctoral research on.
Some people think that procurement and the way we do procurement is one of the major problems, that we're way too bureaucratic. It takes too long. We got to go for the lowest cost. We don't think about Canadian manufacturing. Is that part of what your focus is on?
Yeah, so procurement, absolutely. And in the current context about getting to 2% and beyond, that procurement discussion, I think, has really come back into a significant focus. We've seen some promising signals from Mr. Carney and his new government that they're going to make some key choices and changes to try and unlock that and get it moving. I would put it procurement, though, is just part of one set of public administrative reforms when it comes to our national defense that we need to be able to fix. Recruiting and retention isn't functioning the way that we need it to. The management of the operational readiness of our fleets has got a bunch of issues. Some of it's just money related, but not all money related. So I think there's a bunch of different parts of the administration of Canada's national defense that need to be revitalized in a big hurry. Procurement's just one highly visible and prominent piece.
Well, why don't we take a break and then come to that? Because I think that there's so many priorities that we need to figure out what the priorities are. Because it seems like there's just so much going on. Let's take a break for 2 minutes for some messages and then come back in 2 minutes with David Perry, the president and CEO of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute, talking about how the heck we're going to spend, what'd you say, 60 to 80 billion dollars incremental to what we're currently spending to meet the new target of like 3.5% of GDP spent on defense. It's going to be a big change. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got David Perry with us tonight. He is the president and CEO of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. He's an expert on defense spending. He's got a PhD in that topic. He's worked in numerous different posts in that area, and now he's the president and CEO of a think tank that specializes in looking at defense and other issues from a Canadian global standpoint. I got to ask you, you mentioned recruitment as one of the problems. I'm told that there's more people in the CRA than there is in the armed forces, and that we've got like 1/3 of the force, or 2/3 of the force we need, 1/3 of the force we need not hired. What's going on?
I think a few things. When the pandemic happened and like a whole bunch of the other parts of Canadian society, we had to kind of shut down a lot of the not strictly necessary functions, move people home where they could be. And the recruiting pipeline, all that human interaction was something that could be paused for health and safety considerations. And as we took a long downing of tools on that, restarting it was problematic from a number of different points of view. And the military is basically calibrated to take in a fairly narrow band and pretty regular band of new recruits annually based on assumptions about how many people are going to retire or leave the forces for various different reasons at the other end. And we took close to 2 years where that intake part of that equation was really reduced quite significantly. And then when we restarted recruiting, you basically had 2 recruiting seasons worth of people that weren't in the forces, and that created a close to 10,000 person shortfall. And that put a hole in the overall personnel complement in the Department of National Defense. And ramping that back up has been difficult because we have basically got this system that's calibrated to take in largely enough people to keep it sustained, but not be able to grow it quickly. And they've had a whole number of issues about trying to figure out mechanisms to not just take in 105% of what the normal planning consideration is, but to take in something like 150 or 200% of what the normal planning consideration is. Get people in the front door, go from somebody expressing an interest in joining the Canadian Army or Royal Canadian Navy or Royal Canadian Air Force, having them actually go into a recruiting center, put in an application, and then get to the point where they are a trained and effective member of the Canadian Armed Forces with all of the specific training that is needed for the particular job they're going to do. In some cases, in some of the more technical positions, that can take 4 or 5 years. And all of that lags behind a throttling down of the system that happened during the pandemic. And we're in a lot of ways still getting that ramp backed up. We've got the front end of that, the initial intake. This past year, they actually hit their targets for the first time in several years, which is good. That new intake of an expanded training cohort is going to have to work its way all through the different stops as people go from initial basic training into more specific training for their trade and occupation. In the case of like a pilot, as an example, or a fighter pilot, there are multiple other training stops along the way over the course of a number of years.
So this is a recruiting issue caused by COVID, not a problem that we underpay, that we aren't attractive as a career anymore, that we don't treat people well enough, that we've got issues from a leadership standpoint, things like that. You're not concerned about some of the other things that have been talked about in the press. You think it's recruiting because of COVID issue.
I think that's the biggest single precipitating factor in the current numerical problem we have right now. There's some of those other issues for sure, all the perceptual issues. I think that's probably been more of an issue when it comes to retention and people wanting to leave before they were planning to. In terms of the number of people applying, the last couple of years, we've seen some of the best years the Canadian Forces has had in decades in terms of the number of applicants, which would suggest that there's still a very, very large chunk of both Canadians and permanent residents, because a couple of years ago, there was a change made to allow permanent residents to apply, and tens of thousands of Canadians and permanent residents are applying, which would indicate that there's not overall like a high level macro view of the entire military that much of a consideration about some of the things that you mentioned. Pay, I think, is problematic in a couple places, particularly from a retention point of view. Once people get into the forces, they start having families, increasingly because of rising things like cost of living pressures, housing pressures in particular. More people in the forces are facing issues once they're already in and joined the military, especially if they have a family, if they're being moved around a lot, about being able to have an affordable quality of life. That's an issue. And for some specific places in the military, pilots is a key one. Competition on wages with the private sector has been problematic, but I think some of those other issues are more problematic for keeping people in and serving once they've already joined than it has been a disincentive to prevent people from wanting to join in the first place.
But you got to keep people around, particularly if you've spent lots of money training them and getting them up to speed.
Totally.
What's the list of priorities and how do we choose these priorities? Because I've been told, and you're going to tell me hopefully the whole list, but I've been told we need armaments, we need people, we need munitions, we need guns, we need machine guns, we need frigates, we need submarines, we need icebreakers, we need jets, we need golden domes. Like, what's the list and how do we figure what the priorities are?
So I think you're right. Like the list is very long. It's very extensive. I think you kind of want to dial things back. High level view, the armed forces that we have built and created today are not actually in a position to go to war tomorrow, next week, or even a few months from now. And I'd say that in a couple ways. So beyond the shortages of personnel, the types of military equipment we've been buying, the type of training we've been doing, the amount of stockpiling of war supplies like ammunition, food, spare parts that we have been doing for several generations now has not been sufficient to allow the Canadian military to go to war and fight anything resembling the kind of conflict we're seeing in Ukraine. We have calibrated all of that system around low intensity conflicts at an upper end, the kind of counterinsurgency environment our troops were in Afghanistan, but they're not fundamentally prepared to go fight conventional war.
I was told that we turned down the opportunity to go to Haiti because we didn't even have the abilities to go to Haiti and be a peacekeeping force.
I think there was some considerations about the toll because if you go back in the timeline, that was right around when the personnel shortages were really initially starting to bite. So I think that was part of it. More broadly, though, there's a whole bunch of limitations so big picture, they're not prepared to actually go to war. And I think now we really do need to start doing preparation for potential high intensity peer-on-peer conflict. But beyond that, we haven't kept pace with the kind of investments to adequately allow the armed forces to do even a smaller scale type of conflict like we've basically been trying to plan for them to do. So you can't do Haiti in part because you don't have the preparation to fight a big picture war. You also are not in a position to do Haiti because you haven't actually adequately equipped the organization to do things like Haiti, while also having people in Afghanistan on a relatively um, small in the scheme of things, but consequential for Canada contribution of up to a couple thousand soldiers, and be prepared to be called on to deal with fires and floods back here in Canada.
How many people do we have? I think it's Latvia where we've got a NATO contribution on in Eastern Europe. And you know, I hate to say this, but if Russia attacked Latvia, what would we do?
We would fight the Russian advance along with the other members of the brigade that were there leading, and depending on exactly how it went, involve the other NATO brigades that are alongside our troops in Latvia and the other Baltic states and down into Poland.
Would we be able to supply them, to rearm them, to support them?
I think that there are some significant questions about how long they could actually keep fighting. The previous chief of defense staff basically said that in any kind of conflict like the one we're seeing in Ukraine right now, that the Canadian military would be out of the important munitions they needed on the battlefield in a matter of a few days.
What? A few days, we'd be out of munitions.
Yeah, because again, like we have prepared the military to be able to go do some peacekeeping operations, some relatively low intensity conflicts, things like Afghanistan, where very dangerous environment, but there wasn't anything close to the ammunition usage rates that we're seeing in Ukraine, the need for artillery shells, need for constant resupply, need to replace or restock replacement of parts, restock actual vehicles to deal with battle damage in the same kind of way. We just haven't been planning along that kind of a scenario for multiple generations now.
I guess I thought we were in Latvia as a deterrent to Russia. What you're suggesting is that we're a 2-day deterrent. That's it. That's not much of a deterrent, is it?
Well, it still would have an important impact because the idea would be that they'd be there to engage in an initial Russian push, so that Russia would not just be attacking Latvia; they'd be attacking a wider chunk of the NATO alliance. And the idea would be that those folks would be there to fight in an initial advance until it could be reinforced. I guess the troubling circumstances, at least Canada on its own is not in a position, and granted they're there in a NATO context, so they aren't there alone, and you'd be relying on a lot of other inputs from other allies. But independently, the Canadian military has not been buying anything near enough ammunition for multiple decades.
2 days, 2 days, and we'd be out of munitions.
Well, I don't know if it's as low as two, but basically, General Eyre had said that it was a matter of days, not weeks.
That's unbelievable.
If it was me, if it was 6 days instead of two, I wouldn't feel a whole lot better.
I'd feel a little bit better, but I can imagine a jet coming from somewhere with a whole bunch of new people within a week, but not within 2 days. And so you're right. I don't feel a lot better. I think it's got to be a lot more than that. Okay, so where do we set the priorities? Like munitions is obviously one of them, but that's like got to be and then I want to ask you about how war has changed. I interviewed this guy just the other day from Kyiv who told me that with what's happened with drones in Russia with these attacks, that he called them the Trojan horse attack, that warfare going forward has changed, and we have to rethink things. What do you think about that, sir?
So I think there's an element of truth in that, but I think there's a risk of overstating some things based on a particular set of circumstances the Ukrainians have faced, where through a really remarkable degree of innovation, flexibility, adaptability, agility, they've repurposed, in large part by necessity, and incorporated a bunch of new technology in really innovative and interesting ways. I think, that attack, the Trojan horse attack, is one particularly remarkable instance of that. They've also had to do other things on the battlefield in Ukraine, I think, which have been driven at least as much by necessity, the lack of available artillery ammunition, conventional air defenses, and the scale and quantity that they would have otherwise wanted has driven them to have to innovate. And there's definitely going to be lessons. I worry that we don't have enough effort and focus at trying to capture those in our own military to understand some of these changes as we might want to. And so there's definitely been a lot of adaptation, but I think uh, there's a tendency to think that the new technology is basically much closer to 100% of the solution. Ukraine is still using thousands and thousands and thousands of artillery rounds. They still need a lot of the conventional pieces of heavy equipment, tanks, armored vehicles, air defense systems, long range missiles. They're just complementing a lot of that, and in particularly unique and interesting and innovative ways with automated technology, a whole proliferation of different uses of types and applications for drone technology. So I think moving forward, we need to basically adjust some of our ratio of the conventional with new tech. Just not a question of going all in on the new stuff and forgetting about some of the older stuff, because the Ukrainian front lines are basically still people digging holes in the ground, sitting in trenches, to be there with different firing positions, as well as now encountering this more modern, networked, autonomous drone
Yeah,
challenge.
they've got, from what I understand, like attack drones. They got kamikaze drones. They've got these Russians that got drones that are attached to fiber optic cables, wires such that they can't be jammed. They've got these drones that are the observation drones that can tell people exactly where tanks are or where armaments. And this guy I spoke with from Kyiv said that we're not talking about dozens or hundreds. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of drones that have got to be manufactured, and tens of thousands of operators that have got to be experts in video games. And they put on these goggles, a mile away from the front line, and they maneuver these drones. Like, does the Canadian Army have any of that?
I have a little bit, but nothing close to the scale that you're describing.
Do we need it?
Well, I think between where Ukraine's ended up and where the Canadian military is right now, there's a pretty broad spectrum to adjust the ratio of equipment and the way that the Canadian Army in particular is equipped and trained and staffed. Because you said some of those skill sets that people can put on goggles and play a form of a video game. Some of them still have to do that from basically a ditch in the dirt close to a front line, depending on the type of technology. Some of it can be a little bit further back. So it's not, I think for a lot of these things, it's not just a binary either or type of equipping or training. I think our ratio needs to change fairly significantly, but it's not a question of abandoning all the armor formations, the artillery pieces, and all that kind of thing, and going all in on drones exclusively. It's about adapting the mix that we've got in our own forces.
Let me ask you about manufacturing capability. During the COVID pandemic, we found that we didn't have manufacturing capability for ventilators, for respirators, for pharmaceutical products, for masks. Like masks, we didn't. And supposedly after SARS, we had a royal commission or a judicial commission that said we needed to have inventories of all these things. We didn't turn the inventory. We didn't keep it fresh. And so it ended up being useless. And so therefore we supposedly put in place a whole system of making sure that we had manufacturing and minimum order quantities such that we would keep that manufacturing. And we've stopped that. Do we have manufacturing of armaments, of tanks, of drones, of armored cars, of jets, of frigates? Do we have a self? Can we manufacture any of this stuff ourselves?
We can manufacture a lot of it, but I don't think we've systematically gone and looked at how much production we should have relative to what we do have currently. The bunch of effort to improve this in the last year and a bit. There's a lot of discussion about this in the Liberal platform, as well as the mandate letter the Prime Minister sent to his cabinet, and then again in the throne speech, the need for Canada to have a defence industrial strategy that would get to some of these exact issues that you're describing. What kind of production should we have, and what areas, how much of it? And I think one other thing that we found in the last couple of years is that the existing production that we have today, again, to go back to my comment a few minutes ago, has been scaled. It's not scaled and positioned to support Canada fighting a war. We have had a much lower level of investment, which means the physical pieces of factory equipment, all the factories, the workforce, et cetera, aren't as big as they need to be. And we have been really struggling to ramp up Canadian production of ammunition as an example, and we, to my best of my knowledge, still do not have a contract in place to buy and produce any more bullets for the Canadian military today than we did in the spring of 22, where we first recognized that there was a need to get there, which is a really significant shortcoming that I hope is addressed quite quickly. And there's an example of that in terms of our underproduction of light armored vehicles, which we do make world-class vehicles of in Canada. And there's a number of other components of the industry. We do have shipbuilding. It is, I think, being ramped up quite significantly right now. So that's probably an area where there's a need for less proportional growth, but in a bunch of other places where we either have existing production that isn't being fully utilized, and in other spaces where we probably should make investments that aren't yet being made in Canadian manufacturing capacity. Because if you go to a dynamic, as you're talking about at the outset, where the rest of our alliance and our closest allies are significantly ramping up expenditures to meet these new targets and prepare for actual conflict, those existing production facilities in all over Europe and throughout the United States are, I think, already at the point where they're being tapped out in terms of what they can produce alone. The overlay on top of that, I think the government here has rightly pointed to the fact that we could and should be doing more of this in Canada for a number of different reasons, because it would add overall defense industrial production to the wider NATO alliance, which is something that we could be providing to our allies in greater scope. And then beyond that, the need to actually be able to have more sovereign control over the most critical parts of production is something that I think that we would be smart to be in a much better place in terms of the scope of that. And by what I mean by that is when you have a global conflict, there are generally always a few things that are produced in too finite a quantity that everyone competes for. And if the production facility is in somebody else's country and not in yours, then you don't have as much ability to access things like ammunition or vehicle production as you do if you actually control that within your own political jurisdiction.
Well, we certainly found that during the pandemic when Donald Trump, then the president, the first time said, no, the PPE is not coming across the border. We're going to keep it for ourselves. So, you talk about ramping up manufacturing. You talk about sovereign supply. But you said that we had identified a problem with lack of bullets in the spring of 2022. That was 3 years ago, sir. And maybe I'm a simplistic businessman, but if you identified the problem 3 years ago and you haven't solved it in 3 years, someone should get fired. What's going on?
Well, I think that that's a pretty astute observation. What's going on? It is amongst
too often
the most.
That's thought of as two words.
It is amongst the most astonishing and disappointing things I think that we faced in this space in the last 3 years. It's fairly complicated modern ammunition production, sure, but it is literally not rocket science.
We're going to take a break for some messages, and when I come back with our expert, Mr. Perry, Dr. Perry, David Perry, we're going to ask him about some of the big ticket items because we've been focused on some of the small ticket items. Well, I'll ask about jets. I want to ask about icebreakers, and I want to ask about the Golden Dome. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got a great guest who's an expert on defense spending and defense strategy. What's the organization you're head of?
The Canadian Global Affairs Institute,
which is a think tank, and you focus on what, defense and other global issues?
Canadian international policy, foreign policy, trade, energy export, energy security, and defense.
And where do you get your funding from?
Mix of sources, private donations, corporate sponsorship, government grants are the big ones.
Well, if you have a dinner or something like that sometime, I want to come because it sounds like a great organization. And you've been leading it for a couple of years now.
Yeah.
And before that, you were an analyst.
I was, and before that, I was in grad school.
Fantastic. Well, it sounds like you're doing a great job, and I appreciate you coming on the show. So we've been talking about some small ticket items. Let me ask you now, if I could, about some big ticket items. So jets, we understand that the Liberal government is considering about whether we stick with our current jets and go back to some, Finnish jets. And the benefit might be that they would produce some of it in Canada. And then I'm also told the problem with the US jets is that they control the code and the maintenance and everything like that from the United States. And so therefore, if, believe it or not, there was a president that threatened our sovereignty, he could actually turn these jets off and they wouldn't work. That would never happen, that we'd have a president would threaten our sovereignty. But anyway, and so therefore, just to your sovereign supply issue alone, is that a reason to go to the Finnish jets? So, sir, what should we be doing on our purchase of jets?
So I'm gonna be a little problematic and say we need to not just think about airplanes, but we need to think about our relationship with our core allies and with the United States. So Prime Minister Carney, even before the campaign, made a comment that our previous relationship of increasing integration with the United States economically and in defense and security is over, and we're going to move to some new kind of partnership. From that, and I think that's largely driven by a lot of the conditions you laid out, or at least that's my read of it, there was a commitment to review the purchase of the F-35 fighter jet in particular. From my vantage point, there is no point reviewing the purchase of one plane and making a different decision than has been made and reaffirmed multiple times because it lines up with Canadian defense policy without reviewing the wider Canadian defense policy, which has been premised on tight integration and collaboration and increasing integration and collaboration with the United States Armed Forces for multiple decades. And as a result of that policy direction, the Canadian military buys equipment that would allow it to work in that tight integrated fashion with the United States military. And the F-35 is one example amongst many of how a particular piece of equipment, in this case an airplane, is a kind of a manifestation of the policy choices that the Canadian government has made successively over time. We aren't just buying the plane, we are buying between roughly 40 and 60 billion worth of other gear, equipment, and infrastructure to support that particular plane, a lot of which has particular requirements that have been driven by the choice of plane. And it would also operate in an ecosystem where we're making several tens of other billions of dollars worth of investments in the infrastructure that those planes would land at. So you're talking about not just a very expensive airplane, but rough numbers, but like $100 billion total investment in a whole ecosystem to allow that aircraft to operate because of the policy direction that has previously been given by the Canadian government, that the Canadian Air Force will work to protect the country of Canada within North America, within a NORAD binational command construct with the United States, which means that all of the fighter aircraft and the ecosystem it sits in has to be able to work as closely as possible with the United States Air Force. So the decision about the plane is one that I think has to be taken in context about whether or not the government is actually making a decision or a different decision and giving a different direction to our armed forces and our Department of Defense about how we will work with the United States more generally. And to me, it would make absolutely no sense to make a change on the acquisition of the fighter aircraft without reconsidering the wider ecosystem that it would fit in.
Okay, so then let me ask you about the wider ecosystem. You do have a president of the United States that has changed the name of the Gulf of Mexico, said he's going to take over Panama, said he's going to potentially use military means to take over Greenland. And he had a really good explanation for why Greenland is such an important, part of the national security of North America. And then he said he's going to use economic coercion, hasn't said he would use military force, but economic coercion to make Canada the 51st state. In that kind of a scenario, we haven't had a comment like that since 1893 or something like that. We haven't had a president that's had designs on Canada's sovereignty in more than 100 years. Do we change our thinking? Should we change our thinking?
I think we should change it in the direction of trying to reduce where we can, and in a sensible way, the over-reliance I think we've built up on the United States. And just to kind of paint a wide picture, like our military relies on the United States military for an enormous range of things. on one end of the spectrum, meteorological data, and GPS coordinates. At the other end of the spectrum, all the sophisticated software that makes all of the most sophisticated platforms work. The code that goes into the F-35 is one. The code that's going to go into the combat system on our new naval ships, that's American. In between there, we rely on them currently for aerial refueling for our Canadian pilots to fly to the Canadian North, for the command and control arrangements, for the test and evaluation, the use of the weapons ranges, for training, for officer exchanges, for a whole host of different inputs to the functioning of Canada's defense. We rely very, very highly on the American military. If we actually do turn to a conversation about getting our spending up to 3.5% of GDP, I think part of that shift should have us take hard looks, to go back to the comment you made about sovereignty and our sovereign capability, about what we currently rely on the Americans to provide, that we should pick up a greater share of at a minimum, or build in a level of redundancy where we can, to have more control over our own defenses. I think the difficulty, though, is that one of the things that has allowed the Canadian military to operate is as well as they have been able to in the past decades, despite spending, in some cases, we got down to spending half of what we committed to with NATO, is that we have been able to rely on the United States to provide an enormous range of services and supports that we would have otherwise had to pay for. I think, to get into your comment about the American president, there is way more than a kernel of truth about Trump's comments about Canada underinvesting in the military here and relying on the Americans to provide things that we don't to ourselves.
Okay. So what about Golden Dome?
So you just made a reference not long ago to this really novel and unique attack that the Ukrainians launched into different parts of Russia.
The Trojan horse attack.
Trojan horse attack. And so it was a bunch of things, but it was the use of new and sophisticated application of airborne threats that existing Russian defenses basically aren't adequately prepared to cope with. Seems by some of the initial reporting was a use of a lot of smaller drones all taken together in concert. Existing air defenses in a lot of places aren't really well developed and positioned to deal with that specific type of threat. And as you've seen in the last years in Ukraine, as well as in Israel and as well as in the Middle East, what we increasingly have is a proliferation of technology that you can fire at somebody that will overload defensive systems, which, just by the way that these systems are constructed, almost always have fewer interceptors and fewer chances to shoot down something that's incoming than bad guys can launch at you. And what people have been doing increasingly in Ukraine and Israel and the Red Sea is throwing up a whole bunch of different things all at once, different kinds of missiles, different kinds of drones, and one coordinated attack with and the idea would be to try and overload the system that's trying to defend the most high value targets all at the same time, and force it to make choices about what it shoots down, what it just lets go by because it's really not that important relative to some other opportunities. And I think what the Americans through Golden Dome are envisioning is creating a version of the system that exists in Israel, which is a couple of different systems that knit together to provide a very small country in Israel, geographically, facing a range of different airborne threats from not quite all points on the compass, from a whole bunch of different directions because they're in a bad neighborhood. That's been a highly effective system at allowing limited defensive abilities to be able to intercept most of the most important things fired towards it. There's all kinds of stuff that Israeli system lets go boom in the desert because it's not really that big of a deal. It tries to focus on the most important things coming at high value targets in Israel. And the Golden Dome, from what I understand, is basically a version of that the United States is looking to field to deal with a whole range of potential airborne threats or air-breathing threats coming towards the United States, towards specific pieces of infrastructure that they want to focus on defending. That sets up a whole interesting dynamic for Canada because for a very long time, dating back to the 50s, we have cooperated very closely in the defense of North America against airborne threats in particular. But 20 years ago, the government of Paul Martin made a policy choice that Canada wasn't going to participate in the defense of North America against ballistic missiles specifically. And for 20 years, we've kept to a policy that essentially says we would work with the Americans to both track and then shoot down anything coming through the skies that would hit targets in North America, except for one particular type of missile that follows one particular trajectory. And the Golden Dome system and most other integrated missile defense systems is looking to basically have a coordinated system that's as seamless as possible that tries to deal with any incoming adversary missile or other airborne threat like a drone or a plane in a coordinated fashion to the extent possible. And it would be essentially next to impossible to do that if you were going to choose to opt out of shooting down one particular missile type.
Israel's a little bit smaller than Canada and the United States put together. Can you actually have a Golden Dome that's similar to the Iron Dome for all of North America?
No, well, I mean, if you put enough money and horsepower at things like that, you can solve all kinds of problems. But I think that's likely not what they're actually doing in the same way that Israel doesn't actually defend all of Israel the same way. If things blow up in the Negev desert that is away from any kind of infrastructure, they don't really care. What they focus on is protecting their critical military, political, economic infrastructure and letting stuff that's going to fall somewhere in the forest or somewhere in a desert do so because it's not where you want to focus your limited resources. In the United States, you'd have a similar dynamic. You've got a lot of critical infrastructure that you'd want to protect importantly, but all kinds of North America is trees and mountains. You would not want to see that get damaged in an ideal circumstance, but it's, I think, a system that's going to be designed to focus on a relatively smaller number of really important targets and concentrate efforts there.
We're chatting tonight about Canada's military situation, the amount of money we spend on defense, what that spending should be focused on, what the priorities are. We've talked about the Golden Dome. We've talked about jets. We've talked about what's going on in Ukraine. We talked about the threat from China, North Korea, Iran, etc. That NATO has, the NATO General Secretary has mentioned as a big issue. We're going to come back in 2 minutes with some concluding comments with our guest David Perry, who is an expert on all these issues and is the CEO of an organization that focuses on these issues. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got David Perry with me. He's the president and CEO of the Canadian Global Affairs Institute. We've been talking about Canadian national defense and what the priorities are. David, if Mark Carney asked you over for a coffee and said, "What the heck should I do?" what would you tell him?
Take a couple of big decisions to demonstrate to our allies that we're serious. And under his prime ministership, the check won't just be in the mail, it's actually going to clear. I think our allies have become pretty well inured to hearing Canadian rhetoric about promises to come in the future. And at the point where they're exasperated with our promises that don't ever seem to materialize and they want to see results. So I think the Prime Minister would be smart to focus on maybe 3 or 5 tangible commitments that he can take in the next 3 short weeks before he and the other NATO alliance heads of government meet in The Hague in the Netherlands at the next NATO summit.
Tangible commitments in the next 3 weeks.
That's right.
What would they be? What would your suggestions be?
Well, if I had a magic wand, I think one of them is to actually make the decision and make it public that he's going to actually fund our path to at least 2% of GDP spending on the military. Right now, there's been a commitment. There was language about that in the Liberal platform. And while the formal budget has been deferred until the fall, the Prime Minister can make a funding decision to actually put that money in the bank account of the Department of National Defense. And he could do that before the summit, recognizing that as he and other members of the government has said, there's going to be those discussions about spending beyond 2%. But it'll, as late in the night as this discussion is happening now, as long as my math works reasonably well, you got to get to the number 2 before you get to the number 3 or higher than that. So actually funding the path to 2%, I think, would be a big commitment. I think you could also make an announcement that we're going to move forward quickly with the next phase of a purchase of submarines, as an example. We've been talking about that project. It's been moving fast by Canadian standards. The Prime Minister needs to fund it, and then he could take a step to either actually get to the point of choosing who they want to supply the submarines, or at least launch a process before the summit that would take that project to the next step. That'd be one step. I think some of the other things you could do is actually make some more announcements about who's going to start building the infrastructure that he's been committing to. I would also commit to hiring on another 20,000 troops over and above the numbers they're supposed to be at but aren't. And as a last step, I'd commit another couple $1 billion to improve the short-term readiness of the Canadian Armed Forces.
David Perry, thank you very much for joining us. I really appreciate it. I do think that probably one of the most important things you said is that there is some truth in what Donald Trump has said, and we had Donald Trump up as this threat, this boogeyman during the whole Canadian election. But if there is some truth in some of the things that he's saying in regards to Canada not living up to its obligations, and defense spending is one of those, we need to solve that and take that off the table right away. Otherwise, we are set for some big problems long term, whether it be at NATO or in the upcoming negotiations with the Trump administration. So, David Perry, I really appreciate you mentioning that and encouraging. I wish that Mark Carney would invite you over for coffee, because I like your 3-point strategy in the next 3 weeks. Appreciate it. Thank you, sir.
Thanks for having me on.
That's our show for tonight, everybody. Thank you for joining. I remind you, I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online, even from our nation's capital, at www.saga960am.ca. All my podcasts and videos go up on my website, on social media, on YouTube, and on podcast servers as soon as the radio show goes to air. So there's lots of places that you can get me. I'm sort of like what David is suggesting the Canadian military is all about. We got the big fluting stuff and then the small detailed stuff, all of ways of getting to you and defending. Thank you. Good night, everybody.